So now if I hit F5 to run it, note that it says hello space goodbye space, the end. So this is a small thing to be able to control what gets printed, what the behavior at the end of the line. And note that, in fact, I could put any string in the as part of the end. So if I were to change this and say here star star star, and here I would put in exclamate exclamation point, and now run it. You'll note now that when it terminates the print statement, it now puts in whatever I have in double quotes in the string after the word end. Get it? So this is minor, but it's useful in controlling how printing happens. And let's just suppose that after I have the goodbye and I have the exclamation point, I actually, in fact, want a new line character in there. I want it to go to the next line. Well, then I can put in the backspace n, right? So you remember that the backspace n will go to the new line, or backspace tab goes to inserts a tab character. So if I run this, you'll notice now it says hello, star, 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 goodbye, exclamation point, and then it inserted the new line character so that the end occurred on the next line. Okay, is everybody okay with that? Any questions on that? Okay. I'm not crazy about this, but I need to show this to you because this is standard Python programming shorthand. Also occurs in other programming languages. Okay, if you didn't learn this, if you somehow blanked out for the next 5 minutes, your skills in Python programming would not be compromised. Okay. So we write statements of the form x or count is equal to count plus 1 all the time, right? We did that for the homework twice today. I had school equals schools plus 1 and total schools equal total schools plus 1. It turns out, everybody, that if you wanted to, instead of typing in a statement that says x is equal to x plus 1, that Python allows us to now express that statement as simply saying x plus equal 1. And what that means is this. Get it? So you saved all of typing in one additional x. Fine. I will tell you that this is supported in other programming languages. So if you were to learn how to program in C, this is supported in Java, right? So it's sort of a standard way people write, like incrementing a variable without having to type the whole expression out. Okay, yeah?
Java actually works because they have x plus plus. We use x plus 1.
Yeah, I don't think this has that.
I don't think so. I think I've tried it.
It doesn't work. Okay, this is bad enough. So you also can do the following. So suppose you had x, you had a variable x, and you had a variable y, and what you wanted to do is you wanted to add together x plus y and put it back into x. Instead of having the 1 there, you can simply have the y there. So the plus equal simply takes the x and puts it on the other side of the assignment statement and then adds to it whatever is there. And you could have more than just y. You could have other parts of the expression there. So it's a way of stating that you want to do an increment, or you want to do a change to a variable where that variable is being used in the calculation. This will not be on the exam. I don't care if you use it. If you do use it, that's fine. I just want to show it to you. Okay, so the next thing is important. Okay, so we're all familiar with the notion of creating a list, that we can have a variable that can assume multiple values. So for example, I have a variable called regions that has 4 elements to it, 4 strings, right? Nothing new here. It turns out that Python extends the value of a list by actually allowing you to create lists that have as their elements other lists. So in this example of region, here we see that regions consist of now listen to me, regions consist of 4 elements. However, as opposed to the prior example, which was just a string, here each element of that list is itself a list. So in fact, you can have lists embedded in lists. So again, in this example here, regions is a variable that is a list. It has 4 elements. Each element of the regions list consists of a list itself. So this is the first element of regions. It's a list. That list has 2 elements. This is the second element of regions. It too has 2 elements, as does the third and the fourth. There is no restriction on the number of elements you have in the sublist, nor is there a restriction that the number of elements in each sublist have to be the same number. They could be, the first element could be one, the first list could have 2 elements in it, the second list could have 3 elements in it. Python doesn't care. And why would you want to have lists within lists? It seems like to me, the lists were a good idea. It's very nice to have multiple values associated with a variable. I get it. So why now would you need to be able to have lists within lists? So it turns out that the motivation for having lists within lists is to support this idea of being able to let store information as an array or a table. So suppose you had 2 by 2 element data. So as we have here, we have regions of the country and we have population expressed in millions. So by having the ability to have lists within lists, so now I'm able to support a table. So here I'm able to support having Northeast associated with this population and Midwest associated with this population, and have all that data, all those 8 values, now stored within one variable called regions. And now I have data that actually now assumes the values of what looks to be like a table. That's wrong, I should actually say. So your question should be, okay, great. I buy into this. It seems okay. So, but now that you've given me this ability to define lists within lists, how do I in fact extract out of a variable that is a list and the elements within the list are other lists? How do I extract out individual values from it? So let me copy that. He's an idiot. Okay, fine. So the way you can address individual elements of a list is by having the name of the list, in this case regions. And before, when we had a list that was not consist of other lists in it, we would say regions bracket 1, right? And that would give us the second element in the list. But if I wanted to extract the population in Midwest, what I need to do is supply a second coordinate, because the first coordinate here, regions 1, that tells me what row I'm on. So regions 1 is the Midwest row. And then, now that I'm in the Midwest row, or I now have the Midwest, or the second element, which is in itself a list, now the second coordinate here tells me which element of that second coordinate I want. Since it's a 1, it's going to retrieve the second element, which is the population. If instead I would have said regions 30, then I would have gotten the third list for 3, and I've gotten the first element from that list, the first element being index 0, which is west. So everybody now should be comfortable with, if I have lists that consist of lists, that if I want to get out an element of the sublist, I have to actually give 2 coordinates. Any question on that? Let me type this in and let's. Fortunately, it doesn't. So if I have regions equal to okay, so if I have regions equal to north, east, comma, 53.1 bracket, but I need another bracket here to say a list within a list, comma, bracket, Midwest, comma, 66.9, bracket, comma, bracket, and then I have the South, so now if I had regions here, I print out regions. Let's make sure it's okay. It is. So if I wanted to get out northeast, I would say regions. Okay, I have to say 0 because that's the first list within my list. And now if I just want northeast, it would be 0 again, and that would print out northeast. If I were to say regions, bracket 0, bracket 1, what would that print out? Correct, right? It's the second element in the first list. So, and if I were to say regions, bracket 3, bracket 1, what would that print out? $71.9, because the 3 would get me the third element in the list, and this would give me the second element of that list. So that's the way we reference those different values. And another application, just to show you where this might be used, is suppose you had you had a list, you had distances from one city to the other. How would you represent this? Well, maybe what you could do is the first row would represent the distances from Chicago to every other city, and so the 0th element of distances would be Chicago, and then each element in that list, this list here, would be the distance from Chicago to all the other cities. The second element, or the second list within distances, would represent Boston, and then each of these values would be the distance from Boston to all the other cities and so forth and so on. So being able to have lists within lists provides us with a very, very useful tool for representing data, which we then can subsequently manipulate. And we're encapsulating this all in one variable, so we can it makes it easier for us to write programs that reference the data in that one particular variable. Okay, so why don't you guys try the following? Why don't you guys write a program where you create this data for the regions, the list regions, and then what I want you to do is I want you to print out the total population of the United States, which is the second value in each list. And I want you to do it in two ways. So I want you to first just write a simple arithmetic expression which will consist of 4 parts, the 4 elements of the list, that will compute the total population, put that in one variable, and then see after you do that if you can then, instead of writing that expression that has the 4 components, use a for loop to extract out the population from each of the regions, and put the total of that in another variable, and then print that out. So why don't you guys take a few minutes to try to do that. Okay, so I think the answer is if you set up regions this way, then to get the total population, all you needed to do was to reference each element, sub-element of the regions list. So I'm doing regions 0, 1, because this is the first element in regions, and I'm getting the second element of the list, which is the population. Adding it to the second element of the regions list and getting the second element of that list, and so forth and so on. You'll notice in this expression here that what's constant is the second coordinate. It's always 1 because we're always pointing to the population. And it's the first coordinate that changes because we're getting the different elements in the list. If you were to do this same calculation using a for loop, of course the region statement would be the same, but here I'd create a variable called total pop and initialize it to 0. And notice now, okay, everybody get this, okay, so you need to understand this. So now what I want to do is I want to go through each element in the list, and as opposed to having to specify each one specifically in this arithmetic expression, imagine if we didn't have 4 regions, but we had 50 regions. That would have been fairly tedious to type out that expression 50 times, regions. But instead, and here's the beauty of the for statement within the list, note here that I'm able to, and I use the plus equal, say that take the total population and add to it the total population, plus, everybody look at this, I'm doing regions bracket I bracket 1, where I is going to be a number that's going to vary between 0 and 3 from the for loop. So this is going to iterate 4 times with I assuming the value the first time of 0. So I'm doing 0, 1, which is this one. The second iteration is I is going to assume the value of 1, so I'm getting this value. I'm doing when it's the third iteration, this is going to be 2, so I'm getting this. And when it's the fourth iteration, I'm getting that. Does everybody get it? So for loops are used all the time when you have lists and you're trying to go through elements of the list. And in this case, the fact that we were getting a list that had 2 elements in it really didn't matter because you'll see here that the 1 was a constant.
I did the for loop a different way. So instead of having I in range, I did I in regions. So then when it added, I did I bracket 1, and it still worked for me.
So you did, hold on. Okay, and then what'd you do? For I
In regions?
in regions.
Yeah.
And then you had T is equal to T.
Plus I bracket 1. And then 1 bracket.
That's really clever. Okay. So Python's pretty smart, as you are too. Note here that when we do this, I as a variable will assume first this, and then in the second iteration this, and in the third iteration this. And so as opposed to my solution where you had to specify both, where you're specifying regions, if you did it this way, you only have to specify 1 to get, because each time through, I is going to be a list, and now all you have to do is extract out of it the second element of the list. That's better if you understand that. You should understand both, but that's actually a very good way of doing that. Okay, let's try another problem here for 5 minutes. So now change your regions and add into it a time zone. So for the first one, just put an EST in quotes, CST. And then, so now we've created a new, regions now is a list that consists of still 4 elements, but each element is a list of 3 elements. That's the only difference. We've increased the number of elements in the sublist from 2 to 3. So if you look at it pictorially, now you have a row. In each row it has 3 values. And this is how you would address each individual value. So now what I want you to do is now change your code so that now we print out the and do it using a for loop, print out the population, but only of those in the eastern region, which have a value of EST. It should just take you 1 minute to do that, given the code that we had before. All I want is the population that's in EST. So you have 3. So I want to know the total population in the time zone EST. Okay, so now how do I change my program? I changed my region statement. What do I have to do now? Given that okay. So now I've got to figure out which time zone it's in. How do I do that? Well, I've got to look at now in regions. I've got to look at each element, but now I'm going to look at element number 2 to see if it's equal to EST. That's wrong. I'm looking at element. Oh, no, I am looking at element 2. That's right. And now, if the last element, the third element, is equal to EST, only in that case am I going to add in the second element, which is the population. Everybody okay with this? I think this is pretty straightforward. The next one's a little trickier. Okay, so let's suppose what I want to do is I want to read in, okay, we're going to do this in 2 steps. So what I want to do is I want to now, instead of assigning the value in regions like I did in my program, I want to read in values into a list of lists. I want to get a 2D list again. How do I read in values? So if I asked you, okay, what I want you to do now is write a program that is going to prompt the person for the number of values that they're going to type in. So, and then they're going to type in that number of values, and you're going to put that into a list. You would write the following code, which you've done already. Okay, everybody, this is a little trickier, so everybody's got to watch this. This one isn't. This one everybody has written in this class. So I create a blank list called row. I ask the person how many numbers they want to enter in, how many columns they want to enter in. And then what I do is I set up a for loop where I'm going through from 0 to the number of columns. I'm asking them what value they want. And here's the key, guys, everybody. I then take that value that they typed in and I append it to row, which initially was blank. So now row is a list that after the first iteration will have a value. I then iterate back, and now I ask them for the second value, and now I append that, right? So everybody has now created a list, okay, just this, with now in this case the number of values. So let me just so suppose I want to create a list that has 4 values or columns, and the first element, or the 0th element is going to be 1, the second element's 2, 3, and 4. It, in fact, created a list that had 4 elements in it where I typed in 1 for the first, 2 for the second, 3 for the third, 4 for the fourth. That's all good. Everybody should be down with that. The hard part now is the following. Now I say, I want to let the person say, okay, I want to create these sublists of so many columns, but I also want to allow them to specify how many rows they have. So just like we used to have, we had 4 elements or 4 rows, each with 2 or 3 values. Now I want them to tell me how many rows. We've already seen here how many columns. And so now, I think it's clear here. Everybody's got to pay attention to this. So I'm going to create a variable called table, which is a list that has nothing in it. I'm going to prompt the person to say how many rows you want to enter and how many columns you want to enter. So what I'm ultimately looking for is creating a list of lists like I did before. This code is what we saw before, where we create a row, set it equal to blank, and then prompt the person for the number of columns, enter in have them enter in the value, and then append that to row. This is the code we saw 2 minutes ago. But now I want to take that list that just got created in this loop here, and now I want to append it to another list. This other list I want to append it to is table. So I have one list here called table, and I have another list here called row. And what I want to do is I want to go through and build up row, asking the number of times for the number of values they want, create the variable list called row, and then once I've created one of those, I want to take that row and append it to table, where table has all my data. So let me run this and we'll see. So suppose I want to create something that has 3 rows, and each row has 4 values. So it's asking me for what I want to put in the first row, the first value, I'm going to put in a 1. What I want to put in the first row, the second value, a 2. The first row, the third value, a 3. The first row, the fourth value, a 4. Now it's asking me, and this is in my code, on the second row, what do you want to put in the first value? Let's suppose I want to put in a 5, 6, 7, 8. Now I go to the next row, 9, 10, 11, 12, and now I'm done. And notice now that I've created a list that has 1 sublist, 2 sublists, and 3 sublists, or 3 rows. That's what I asked up here. And each of these sublists has 1, 2, 3, 4 values, which is what I have here for the number of columns. So this is what we had typed in before. And this code that I have here is the code that you would use to create that. So what I've used here, everybody still got 5 minutes. You have to give me my 5 minutes. What I really have here is 2 for loops. This outer for loop is controlling the number of rows, and this inner for loop is controlling the number of columns. So I'm executing this number of columns, which creates the row list for as many rows as being asked for. And the only tricky part I think here is two tricky parts. The for loop, the nested for loop, but I think it makes sense here because this one for loop is controlling for the number of rows, and the second for loop is controlling for the number of columns. The tricky part here is at note where before I always appended a particular value, there is no restriction that when you do an append, you can only append one value. You can append actually a row because remember, you can append a list because remember, row is a list that I'm appending here. So this inner loop is creating the list of each of the inner lists, and once I'm done creating it, I want to add it to the table. And note that when I come back and I do each iteration of the outer loop, I reinitialize row to be equal to nothing because I want to start with nothing because I'm creating a new inner list. And you'll be able to, when you look at this code at home, you'll be able to see why I've done this. It's just the print statement. So again, this code here, note that when I ran it, it gave me a set of 4 prompts for the first row, a set of 4 prompts for the second row, and a set of 4 prompts for the third row. And so it was doing the inner loop 4 times, and it was doing that inner loop 3 times each for each of the rows. And that is controlled by here. This is controlling the number of times I do it for the rows, and this is for each of the rows the number of columns that I need. You'll need to play with this, okay? So for homework, here's the deal. I haven't done this before. So for homework, we're going to exercise, the homework assignment is going to exercise using a list within a list. Very, very similar to what we've done here. You're going to write a program that is going to create, using random numbers, lists within lists. It's described in the problem, okay? The only difference with the assignment for, let's do Monday, is I'm providing you with the skeleton of the program. So what I'm providing you with is, so you're going to download this. This is on Blackboard. So I have done some of the programming of the assignment. I've actually provided you with the main routine, and I've provided you with one of the functions that got called. I've also set the board equal to nothing and created this other variable called size. So 2 things. If you think I program crappy, that's fine. You can do this all from scratch if you like. Let me be serious. If you want to try to do this assignment completely on your own, you're free to do so. If you don't want to do that, if you want to start off with the code that I've generated, I am somewhat sympathetic to that. A, this is a harder concept, and B, it's the end of the semester, and all these other professors are not particularly sympathetic to the most important course that you're taking, are probably giving you term papers to write and exams to study for. It's a guess. So I understand that your days are filled up with other useless things that you need to do. So in taking account of that, I thought maybe I would give you a leg up and give you some of the starting code. For sure, I know there are a number of people here who love to write the programs. That's not a joke. They've told me that. So if you want, simply take this from the get-go and just write it yourself. Otherwise, you can download it. It's in Blackboard. You can download this as the start. You can get a feel for how you fiddle around with these 2-dimensional arrays from the code that I've written, and hopefully that will jumpstart you to write this program. Okay? Okay, that's it. I'll see you on Monday.